As the day quietly fades and stars begin to whisper above, welcome to Korean History Whispers. Tonight, we enter the mind of King Sejong, the visionary monarch who turned his realm into the cultural jewel of East Asia. While his achievements shine brightly in history, tonight you will discover the quiet dreams that shaped them. Close your eyes and let his whispered memories carry you to peaceful sleep. In the spring of 1397, as cherry blossoms painted the hills around the newly established capital of Hanyang, a child was born who would fundamentally reshape the destiny of Korea. He entered the world not as a crown prince destined for greatness, but as the third son of King Sejong, a position that traditionally meant a life of comfortable obscurity, rather than royal responsibility. The infant who would become King Sejong drew his first breath in his father's private residence in Jeonsu Ward. Far from the grand palaces where future kings typically made their entrance into the world. His given name was Du, and his courtesy name was Wonjeong, but it was the temple name Sejong by which history would remember him. Even in these humble circumstances, there seemed to be something different about this particular prince. Though no one could have predicted the extraordinary path that lay ahead, his father, King Sejong, had seized the throne through what history diplomatically calls the Prince's Rebellion. The brutal truth was simpler. Sejong had eliminated his brothers and nephews to claim power, justifying his actions by arguing that proper succession should follow the eldest legitimate son rather than the youngest, as his own father King Tajo had originally intended. Having used the principle of primogeniture to legitimize his own rule, Sejong felt bound to honor that same principle in choosing his heir. His commitment to legitimate succession led to the elevation of Prince Ji, Sejong's eldest son, who was given the title Wonjegan in 1402 and formally invested as crown prince 2 years later. History would know him as Prince Yangneong, and his story became a cautionary tale about the burdens of royal expectation, and the consequences of personal weakness in positions of ultimate responsibility. Prince Yangneong possessed intelligence and charisma, but these gifts were overshadowed by a fundamental lack of self-discipline that grew more problematic as he matured. While his younger brothers buried themselves in classical texts and philosophical discussions, Yangneong seemed drawn to more immediate pleasures. His academic performance was inconsistent, his behavior often inappropriate for someone destined to rule, and his inability to control his impulses created a series of scandals that increasingly embarrassed the royal family. For King Sejong, watching his eldest son's failures must have been agonizing. The king who had sacrificed so much to establish a stable dynasty now faced the possibility that his heir might destroy everything he had built. The principle of primogeniture that had justified Sejong's own rise to power was becoming a trap that threatened to saddle the kingdom with an unfit ruler. As Prince Yangneong's problems mounted, attention within the royal family gradually shifted to his younger siblings. The second son had died young, leaving Prince Chunjeong, the future Sejong, as the most promising alternative. Where Yangneong was impulsive, Chunjeong was thoughtful. Where the crown prince struggled with his studies, the third prince excelled. Where Yangneong created problems, Chunjeong seemed naturally inclined towards solutions. The contrast became impossible to ignore. In 1408, when Prince Chunjeong was just 11 years old, he was elevated to the rank of Chundeongan. 4 years later, his status was further enhanced when he became Cheongyeongdaegun, a title that placed him among the highest reigning princes in the kingdom. These promotions reflected growing recognition that the third son possessed qualities that the first son lacked, but rank and recognition were one thing. Marriage was quite another. Royal marriages were diplomatic instruments that created lasting bonds between the crown and powerful aristocratic families. In 1408, the same year he received his first noble title, Prince Cheonjeong was married to the daughter of Simon of the Chinsong Sim clan. She would become Queen Sohyun, and their marriage would prove to be both personally fulfilling and politically complicated in ways that neither young person could have anticipated. The wedding ceremony reflected the careful calculations that governed royal alliances. Simon was not merely a courtier, but a significant political figure, whose family's support could strengthen or weaken the dynasty, depending on how they were treated. By connecting his son to the Sim family, King Sejong was simultaneously honoring their loyalty and ensuring their continued commitment to his rule. Cradle for Prince Jiphyeonjeon. Now a married man with growing responsibilities, the contrast with his older brother became even more pronounced. While he was building a reputation for scholarly excellence and political maturity, Prince Yeongnyeong continued to struggle with the basic requirements of royal conduct. The situation was becoming unsustainable, and everyone at court understood that difficult decisions lay ahead. The crisis reached its climax in 1418, when King Sejong made the extraordinary decision to bypass his eldest son entirely. Prince Yeongnyeong was formally deposed as crown prince, and Prince Jiphyeonjeon was elevated to take his place. The announcement sent shockwaves through the kingdom, not because anyone questioned the wisdom of the decision, but because it represented such a dramatic departure from traditional succession practices. The speed of subsequent events suggests that King Sejong had been planning this transition for some time. On the 3rd of June, 1418, Prince Jiphyeonjeon was formally invested as crown prince. Less than 3 months later, on the 10th of August, he was receiving his father's abdication and ascending to the throne in the Jiphyeonjeon Hall of Gyeongbok Palace. At the age of 21, the third son who had never expected to rule found himself king of Korea. But Sejong's abdication came with a crucial caveat that revealed his understanding of his son's strengths and limitations. While the young king would handle domestic governance and cultural development, military affairs would remain under the retired king's direct control, until Sejong reached the age of 30. This arrangement reflected both Sejong's recognition of his son's scholarly inclinations, and his own reluctance to surrender the military power that had made his rule possible. The early years of Sejong's reign were thus marked by a unique dual authority structure. The young king devoted himself to the intellectual and administrative challenges of governance, consulting with scholars, studying classical texts, and developing policies that reflected his deep commitment to Confucian principles. Meanwhile, his father maintained control over the military establishment, ensuring that external threats could be met with decisive force, while domestic stability was preserved. This division of responsibility might have created tension between father and son, but instead it seemed to allow each man to focus on his natural strengths. Sejong could continue to protect the kingdom through military vigilance, while Sejong could begin the cultural and intellectual transformation that would define his reign. The arrangement worked because both men understood that their ultimate goal was the same: strengthening the Joseon dynasty and ensuring its survival for future generations. But even as he settled into his new role, King Sejong faced a personal crisis that would test both his resilience and his political judgment. The execution of his father-in-law, Joseon, in 1421 was a brutal reminder that royal power came with terrible costs. Sejong, still controlling military affairs, had identified Simon as a potential threat to royal authority, and ordered his execution along with several associates. For Sejong, this was not merely a political decision, but a personal tragedy. Simon was not just his wife's father, but a man who had welcomed him into the family, and supported his rise to power. Queen Sohir, pregnant with their first child, was devastated by her father's death. The young king found himself caught between loyalty to his own father's judgment and grief for his wife's loss. The incident revealed the harsh realities that would shape Sejong's entire reign. Royal power required constant vigilance against potential challenges, and even family connections could not protect those who were perceived as threats to dynastic stability. The king who dreamed of creating a more enlightened and cultured kingdom was forced to confront the violence that underlied all political authority. Yet rather than becoming cynical or withdrawn, Sejong seemed to draw from this tragedy a deeper commitment to creating a form of governance that relied more on moral authority and intellectual excellence than on fear and coercion. If he could not prevent all political violence, he could at least work to create a system where such violence would become increasingly unnecessary. In 1422, when the former King Taejong died, Sejong finally gained complete control over his kingdom. At 25, he was no longer the unexpected king, but the undisputed ruler of a realm that was still finding its identity. The question that would define the rest of his reign was whether he could transform Korea from a military monarchy into something approaching a philosophical republic while maintaining the strength necessary to survive in a dangerous world. The young man who had been raised to expect a comfortable life as a secondary prince was now responsible for the welfare. The decisions he made in the coming decades would determine whether the Joseon kingdom would be remembered as just another short-lived military regime or as one of history's most remarkable experiments in enlightened governance. The transformation of Korea began not with grand proclamations or military conquests, but with a quiet decision made in the royal library on a spring morning in 1420. King Sejong, barely 23 years old, and having ruled for less than 2 years, was poring over classical Chinese texts when he realized that his kingdom's greatest weakness was not military vulnerability or economic instability, but intellectual poverty. Korea had talented individuals, certainly, but it lacked the systematic approach to knowledge that characterized the great civilizations of history. If the Joseon dynasty was to become more than just another military monarchy, it needed institutions that could nurture wisdom, preserve learning, and transform theoretical knowledge into practical governance. This realization led to one of the most revolutionary decisions in Korean history, the establishment of Jiphyeonjeon, the Hall of Worthies. The concept was not entirely original. Similar institutions had existed in Tang and Song dynasty China, serving as centers of learning and repositories of imperial wisdom. But what Sejong envisioned was something more ambitious than a mere scholarly retreat. He wanted to create Korea's first true think tank, a place where the brightest minds of the kingdom could dedicate themselves entirely to research, writing, and the practical application of knowledge to governance. The selection process for Jiphyeonjeon scholars was meticulous and demanding. Sejong personally interviewed candidates, testing not only their mastery of classical texts but also their ability to think creatively about contemporary problems. He was looking for more than academic brilliance. He wanted intellectuals who could bridge the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical policy. Among those chosen were men who would become legendary figures in Korean intellectual history. There was Cho Vang, whose expertise in astronomy would revolutionize Korean understanding of celestial mechanics. Park Pang-nayeon, whose literary skills would help create some of the most important works of the era. Shin Sok-shin, whose linguistic abilities would prove crucial in developing the Korean writing system. Lee Hae-in, whose philosophical insights would help establish Confucian governance principles, but selecting brilliant scholars was only the first step. Sejong understood that intellectual creativity required both material support and freedom from mundane distractions. This insight led to one of his most innovative policies, Sahagadokseo, or home study leave. Selected Jiphyeonjeon scholars would be given extended periods of time, sometimes lasting months, during which they were freed from all official duties and encouraged to pursue their research wherever their curiosity might lead them. The concept was revolutionary for its time. In an era when government officials were expected to be constantly available for administrative duties, Sejong was essentially paying scholars to think, read, and explore ideas without immediate practical applications. Critics at court complained that this was an expensive luxury the young kingdom could not afford. But Sejong understood that intellectual investment would pay dividends that military spending could never match. The first Sahae-Doxio program was implemented in December 1426. And its effects exceeded even Sejong's optimistic expectations. Scholars returned from their study leaves with research proposals, literary works, and policy recommendations that demonstrated depths of learning and creativity previously unknown in Korean intellectual circles. The program was so successful that it was repeated multiple times, with each iteration producing new insights and innovations. Within Jiphyeonjeon's walls, scholars worked on projects that ranged from the highly practical to the seemingly abstract. They studied historical precedents for tax reform, analyzed diplomatic correspondence from neighboring kingdoms, developed new methods for measuring rainfall and predicting weather patterns, and compiled encyclopedic works on medicine, agriculture, and military technology. No area of human knowledge was considered irrelevant to the task of governance. But the most ambitious project undertaken by Jiphyeonjeon scholars was also the most controversial: the development of a native Korean writing system. For centuries, Korea had relied on Chinese characters for written communication, a system that worked well for educated elites, but left the vast majority of the population functionally illiterate. Sejong believed that a truly civilized kingdom should have a writing system that allowed all its people, regardless of social class or educational background, to participate in written culture. The project began in secret around 1443, with Sejong working closely with his most trusted linguistic scholars. The challenge was enormous. How do you create a writing system that accurately represents the sounds of Korean speech while remaining simple enough for ordinary people to learn? Existing alphabetic systems from other cultures provided some guidance, but Korean phonology was sufficiently unique that wholesale borrowing was impossible. The solution they developed was elegant in its simplicity and revolutionary in its implications. Rather than using arbitrary symbols to represent sounds, the new Korean writing system used visual representations of the physical positions taken by the tongue, lips, and throat when producing different sounds. The shape of the letter for mimicked the position of the tongue when making that sound. The letter for im reflected the closed lips necessary for that consonant. Its scientific approach to writing system design was unprecedented in world history. While other alphabets had evolved gradually through cultural transmission and modification, Jiphyeonjeon, as the new Korean script was called, was created through systematic analysis of linguistic principles. It represented not just a practical tool for communication but a philosophical statement about the relationship between language, knowledge, and human dignity. The opposition to this innovation was immediate and fierce. Conservative scholars, led by Choiman, Ri and Kimman, argued that abandoning Chinese characters would isolate Korea from the broader East Asian cultural sphere and undermine the kingdom's connections to classical learning. They presented formal petitions denouncing the new writing system as barbaric and unnecessary, claiming that it would encourage intellectual laziness and cultural decline. Sejong's response revealed both his intellectual confidence and his political determination. Rather than simply overruling his critics, he engaged them in sustained debate, using classical precedents and philosophical arguments to defend his position. He pointed out that China itself had modified its writing practices over the centuries, and that cultural authenticity did not require slavish imitation of foreign models. Most importantly, he argued that a truly Confucian ruler should seek to educate all his subjects, not just maintain the privileges of an educated elite. The debate over Jiphyeonjeon lasted 4 years. But Sejong never wavered in his commitment to the project. In 1446, after extensive testing and refinement, the new writing system was officially promulgated throughout the kingdom. The royal proclamation announcing its release was both practical and poetic. explaining the technical features of the script while celebrating its potential to liberate the Korean people from linguistic dependency on foreign cultures. To demonstrate the practical applications of Jiphyeonjeon, Sejong immediately commissioned several major literary projects. The Songs of Flying Dragons was translated into the new script, making this epic poem celebrating the founding of the Joseon dynasty accessible to readers who could not manage classical Chinese. The Illustrated Guide to the Three Bonds, a moral instruction manual, was published with Korean script annotations that explained Confucian principles in everyday language. These publications served multiple purposes simultaneously. They provided practical examples of how the new writing system could be used for serious literary and educational purposes. They demonstrated that Korean script was capable of expressing complex philosophical and historical concepts. And they began the process of creating a Korean vernacular literature that could stand alongside classical Chinese works in terms of intellectual sophistication and cultural importance. The scientific revolution that accompanied these literary achievements was equally remarkable. Under Sejong's patronage, Korean astronomers developed new instruments for celestial observation and created more accurate calendars for agricultural planning. The world's first standardized rain gauge was invented and distributed throughout the kingdom, allowing for systematic collection of meteorological data that improved crop yields and disaster preparedness. Medical knowledge advanced through the compilation of comprehensive handbooks that combined traditional East Asian healing practices with systematic observation of Korean herbs and treatment methods. The complete collection of native Korean prescriptions became a standard reference work that reduced Korean dependence on imported medicines, while improving health outcomes for ordinary people. Agricultural innovation flourished as royal researchers traveled throughout the southern provinces, interviewing experienced farmers and documenting traditional cultivation techniques that had never been systematically recorded. The resulting Straight Talk on Farming provided practical guidance that helped Korean agriculture become more efficient and productive. Even military technology benefited from this systematic approach to knowledge. New designs for cannons and firearms were developed through careful study of metallurgy and ballistics, while improved fortress construction techniques enhanced the kingdom's defensive capabilities. The records of artillery compiled detailed instructions for manufacturing and using these weapons, ensuring that military knowledge would not be lost with the death of individual craftsmen. Throughout all these projects, Sejong maintained direct personal involvement that reflected both his intellectual curiosity and his commitment to practical results. He regularly visited Jiphyeonjeon to discuss ongoing research, participated in scholarly debates about theoretical questions, and insisted on testing new innovations before approving their wider implementation. The scholar king had become not just a patron of learning, but an active participant in the intellectual revolution he had initiated by the mid-1440s. The transformation was visible throughout Korean society. Literacy rates were rising as the new writing system made learning accessible to broader segments of the population. Agricultural productivity was improving through the application of systematic farming techniques. Scientific knowledge was advancing through careful observation and documentation of natural phenomena. Cultural confidence was growing as Koreans developed their own literary and artistic traditions, rather than simply imitating Chinese models. But perhaps most importantly, a new vision of governance was emerging that would influence Korean political culture for centuries to come. Sejong had demonstrated that effective rule required not just military strength or economic prosperity, but intellectual excellence and cultural sophistication. The kingdom that invested in knowledge, he had shown, would ultimately prove stronger and more durable than those that relied solely on force or wealth. The true measure of enlightened governance, King Sejong believed, lay not in grand gestures or impressive monuments, but in the daily experiences of ordinary people. By the 1430s, his intellectual revolution had created the tools for transformation. Now came the far more difficult task of applying those tools to solve the practical problems that affected millions of Korean lives. The most pressing challenge was taxation. A system so corrupt and unpredictable that it threatened to destroy the very people it was meant to support. For generations, Korean farmers had endured the land inspection and loss assessment method, a system that theoretically adjusted tax rates based on annual crop yields, but in practice became a vehicle for official corruption and arbitrary exploitation. Under this system, government inspectors would visit each village after harvest to evaluate crop yields and determine appropriate tax rates. The process seemed reasonable in theory, but implementation was a nightmare of favoritism, bribery, and deliberate misassessment. Wealthy landowners could purchase favorable evaluations, while poor farmers found themselves taxed at rates that left them unable to feed their own families. Sejong understood that no amount of cultural advancement could compensate for an economic system that impoverished the people it was meant to serve. But tax reform was perhaps the most politically dangerous undertaking any ruler could attempt. Existing arrangements, however flawed, had created networks of beneficiaries who would resist change with every resource at their disposal. The solution he developed was characteristically innovative. Rather than simply decreeing a new system, he would create the most extensive public consultation process in Korean history. In 1436, the Gongbeop Preview Office was established with a mandate to design a fair and sustainable taxation system through systematic analysis of existing conditions and comprehensive public input. What followed was an exercise in democratic governance that would not be matched anywhere in the world for centuries. Royal commissioners traveled to every corner of the kingdom, conducting detailed interviews with farmers, landowners, local officials, and merchants. They collected data on soil quality, typical crop yields, local economic conditions, and the practical effects of existing tax policies. But Sejong went even further. Recognizing that sustainable reform required genuine popular support, he ordered the most comprehensive public opinion survey in pre-modern history. Approximately 170,000 people, from high-ranking officials to village farmers, were asked to evaluate different proposed tax systems and indicate their preferences for reform. The scale of this consultation was unprecedented. Never before had any government, anywhere in the world, sought input from such a broad cross-section of society on major policy questions. The logistics alone were staggering. Organizing surveys across a mountainous peninsula, translating complex policy proposals into language that ordinary farmers could understand, collecting and analyzing responses from tens of thousands of participants. The results validated Sejong's faith in the wisdom of ordinary people. Despite their different economic circumstances and regional backgrounds, the vast majority of respondents supported a simplified system that would replace arbitrary annual assessments with fixed rates based on land quality. They were willing to accept moderate tax levels if they could be confident that those levels would remain stable and fairly applied. The new Gongbeop system reflected these preferences while incorporating advanced administrative techniques developed by Jiphyeonjeon scholars. Land was classified into 6 categories based on soil fertility and geographic conditions. Weather patterns were analyzed and categorized into 9 types based on their effects on agricultural productivity. The basic tax rate was set at 1/20th of expected yield, a level that provided adequate government revenue while leaving farmers sufficient resources for subsistence and investment. Implementation of Gongbeop represented a triumph of systematic governance over arbitrary power. Local officials could no longer manipulate assessments for personal gain because the criteria were standardized and publicly known. Farmers could plan their economic activities with confidence because tax obligations were predictable. The royal treasury gained a stable revenue stream that funded the cultural and scientific projects that defined Sejong's reign, but tax reform was only one element of a broader transformation in Korean governance. The legal system underwent equally systematic revision. producing comprehensive law codes that replace centuries of ad hoc precedents with rational, clearly articulated principles. The new compilation of the Comprehensive Laws of Government established uniform procedures for everything from criminal prosecution to administrative promotion, creating a rule of law that protected both officials and ordinary citizens from arbitrary treatment. Ritual and ceremonial practices, seemingly peripheral concerns, received similar attention because Sejong understood their importance for social cohesion and political legitimacy. The 5 categories of state ceremonies codified appropriate protocols for everything from royal weddings to diplomatic receptions, ensuring that the young Joseon dynasty would project the cultural sophistication necessary for international respect. Music, too, became a vehicle for expressing Korean identity and values, rather than simply copying Chinese court music. Sejong commissioned original compositions that reflected Korean aesthetic sensibilities while meeting the technical requirements of state ceremonies. The establishment of great works, preservation of great peace, and Phoenix Comes became iconic pieces that demonstrated Korea's capacity for cultural innovation. The development of a uniquely Korean musical notation system paralleled the creation of Jiphyeonjeon in its combination of scientific precision and pract. Jeongunbo, or, well, field notation, allowed composers to indicate not just pitch and rhythm, but also subtle variations in timing and expression that had previously been transmitted only through oral tradition. This innovation enabled the systematic preservation and teaching of Korean musical heritage while facilitating new compositional techniques. Scientific advancement continued at an accelerated pace as royal patronage attracted talented researchers and provided them with unprecedented resources. The astronomical instruments created during this period rivaled anything produced in contemporary China or the Islamic world, while the systematic weather monitoring program generated data that improved agricultural planning throughout the kingdom. Medical knowledge expanded through projects that combined empirical observation with systematic compilation of traditional wisdom. The complete collection of native Korean prescriptions reduced Korean dependence on imported medicines, while improving treatment outcomes for common ailments. The classified collection of medical prescriptions organized existing medical knowledge in ways that made it more accessible to practicing physicians throughout the kingdom. Agricultural innovation proceeded through careful documentation of regional farming techniques and systematic experimentation with new methods. The Straight Talk on Farming became a standard reference that helped Korean agriculture achieve levels of productivity that supported both population growth and economic diversification. Military technology advanced through projects that applied scientific principles to practical defense needs. New designs for cannons and firearms reflected sophisticated understanding of metallurgy and ballistics, while improved fortification techniques enhanced the kingdom's capacity to resist external threats. The records of artillery ensured that military innovations would not be lost with the death of individual craftsmen, perhaps most remarkably. All of these diverse projects were coordinated through administrative systems that anticipated modern bureaucratic practices by centuries. Detailed records were maintained of research progress, resource allocation, and policy outcomes. Regular reports allowed the king to monitor developments across multiple fields simultaneously. Systematic evaluation procedures ensured that projects that failed to produce useful results were terminated rather than continued indefinitely. The northern frontier expansion that occurred during this period exemplified Sejong's integration of cultural development with strategic necessity. The establishment of 4 counties along the Yalu River and 6 fortresses along the Tumen River was not merely military conquest, but systematic colonization that extended Korean administrative, economic, and cultural institutions into previously unsettled territories. These frontier settlements became laboratories for testing new agricultural techniques, administrative procedures, and cultural policies under challenging conditions. The success of these experiments validated the broader principle that Korean civilization had achieved sufficient sophistication to expand beyond its traditional boundaries while maintaining its distinctive characteristics. Kim Jong-seo's leadership of the northeastern expansion demonstrated how military competence could be combined with cultural sophistication to achieve lasting results. Rather than simply establishing military outposts, the expansion created permanent settlements that extended Korean civilization into regions that had previously been contested borderlands. The completion of these territorial expansions meant that Korea's modern boundaries were essentially established during Sejong's reign. The Yalu and Taman rivers became permanent frontiers that would define Korean geography for centuries to come. While the integration of these northern territories added both strategic depth and economic resources to the kingdom. By the 1440s, the cumulative effect of these diverse reforms had transformed Korea from a recently established military monarchy into one of the most sophisticated civilizations in East Asia. Literacy rates were rising, agricultural productivity was increasing, scientific knowledge was advancing, and cultural confidence was growing as Koreans developed their own traditions, rather than simply imitating foreign models. The integration of all these changes represented an achievement in systematic governance that would not be matched anywhere in the world for centuries. Sejong had demonstrated that enlightened leadership, supported by systematic research and genuine popular consultation, could create a form of government that served both elite interests and popular welfare, while maintaining the strength necessary for national survival in a competitive international environment. The chronicles of great rulers often focus on their public triumphs while overlooking the private costs of extraordinary achievement. But King Sejong's story cannot be complete without acknowledging the personal tragedies and physical suffering that shadowed his most brilliant accomplishments. The man who transformed Korean civilization paid a price that would have broken lesser spirits, yet somehow found within his pain the inspiration for even greater works. The first blow came early in his reign, striking at the heart of his family relationships. In 1421, the execution of his father-in-law Simon had wounded both the king and Queen Sohyeon. But they had found ways to process that political tragedy within the brutal realities of royal power. Far more devastating were the losses that began in 1424. When death started claiming the children who represented their hopes for the dynasty's future. Princess Jiangso, their eldest daughter, was the first to fall. She had been the light of the royal household, a brilliant child whose early fascination with learning had delighted her father, and suggested that the next generation might inherit his intellectual gifts. Her death at a young age left a void that could never be filled, transforming the king's understanding of how fragile human happiness truly was. But this was only the beginning of sorrows that would test even Sejong's remarkable resilience. In December 1444, Prince Gongbeop, their fifth son, died suddenly. The loss was particularly cruel because the prince had shown exceptional promise, displaying both the scholarly inclinations that his father valued and the practical wisdom necessary for effective governance. His death represented not just personal grief, but the loss of potential that might have benefited the entire kingdom. Before the royal family could fully process this tragedy, another devastating blow followed. In January 1445, just 1 month after Prince Gongbeop's death, Prince Pyongyang, the seventh son, also died. Two promising young princes lost within weeks of each other created a crisis that went beyond personal mourning to threaten the psychological foundations of the royal household. For Queen Sohye, these losses were unbearable. The woman who had stood beside her husband through political crises and supported his revolutionary policies now found herself drowning in a grief that no amount of royal privilege could alleviate. The death of children strikes at something fundamental in the human psyche. And even queens are not immune to the devastating pain of parental loss. The final blow came in April 1446, when Queen Sohyeon herself died. Her health apparently broken by the cumulative weight of her losses.
The timing was particularly cruel,
coming just as Sejong was preparing to announce the official promulgation of Hunminjeongeum,
the writing system that represented the culmination of his cultural revolution.
The moment of his greatest intellectual triumph became simultaneously the nadir of his personal happiness.
At 49 years old,
King Sejong found himself a widower, who had lost not only his beloved wife, but also several of the children in whom he had invested his deepest hopes. The man who had created systems for everything from taxation to musical notation now faced emotional chaos that no amount of systematic thinking could resolve. Yet somehow, rather than retreating into bitterness or abandoning his reform agenda, he channeled his grief into even greater dedication to the cultural projects that had defined his reign.
The physical toll of these emotional traumas was compounded by health problems that had plagued
Sejong since his 20s. The royal chronicles record approximately 50 separate instances of illness during his reign, suggesting a level of chronic poor health that would have incapacitated a less determined ruler. These were not minor ailments but serious conditions that frequently left him bedridden for weeks at a time. Modern medical analysis of the symptoms described in historical records suggests that Sejong suffered from diabetes, a condition that would have been both painful and progressively debilitating in an era before effective treatment. The constant fatigue, vision problems, and other complications associated with this disease would have made the intensive intellectual work that characterized his reign extraordinarily difficult. Yet rather than allowing his health problems to limit his activities, Sejong adapted his working methods to accommodate his physical limitations. When he could no longer maintain the demanding schedule of personal audiences and administrative oversight that had characterized his early reign, he developed new systems for delegation and remote management that actually improved governmental efficiency. In 1436, he formally transitioned from the Six Ministries direct report system, which required him to personally review all major decisions, to the State Council deliberation system, which allowed trusted advisors to handle routine matters, while reserving only the most important issues for royal attention. This change was driven partly by his health concerns, but it also reflected his growing confidence in the administrative systems he had created. The appointment of Crown Prince Hyang in 1421 had provided the foundation for further delegation of responsibilities. By 1445, as his health problems intensified and his grief over family losses deepened, Sejong began transferring routine administrative duties to his son while reserving his own energy for the cultural and scientific projects that had become his greatest passion. His transition allowed the aging king to focus his remaining strength on the work that only he could accomplish, while Crown Prince Hyang handled day-to-day governance. Sejong devoted himself to completing the great compilations and systematic studies that would preserve Korean cultural achievements for future generations. The comprehensive laws of government and records of outstanding events were finalized during this period, ensuring that the administrative innovations of his reign would survive even if the personal knowledge that had created them was lost. The scientific projects that had flourished under royal patronage also reached their culmination during these final years. The astronomical instruments and weather monitoring systems established earlier in his reign generated increasingly sophisticated data that improved both agricultural planning and calendar accuracy. The medical encyclopedias compiled by royal physicians provided comprehensive guides to treatment methods that reduced Korean dependence on foreign medical knowledge. But perhaps most importantly, the writing system that had been his most controversial innovation began to demonstrate its practical value as literacy rates rose throughout the kingdom. The books published in Hunminjeongeum during Sejong's final years proved that the new script could handle everything from philosophical treatises to technical manuals, validating his faith in its potential to democratize access to written culture. The personal cost of these achievements became increasingly apparent as the 1440s progressed. Court observers noted that the king, who had once been energetic and optimistic, now appeared frequently tired and melancholy. The loss of his wife and children had left
emotional wounds that never fully healed,
while his deteriorating health made even simple activities increasingly difficult.
Yet those who knew him best also observed that these personal struggles seemed to deepen rather than diminish his commitment to the welfare of his people. The king, who had experienced profound loss, became more rather than less concerned with alleviating the sufferings of ordinary Koreans. The ruler, who faced his own mortality with growing awareness, became more determined to create institutions that would outlast any individual life. In February 1450, recognizing that his strength was finally failing, Sejong moved from the main palace to the private residence of Prince Yeongung, seeking a quieter environment where he could spend his remaining time with family rather than courtiers. The decision was both practical and symbolic, representing his final transition from
public ruler to private patriarch. On the 17th of February, 1450, at the age of 54, King Sejong died peacefully in the east-detached palace of Prince Yeongung's residence.
His final words,
according to the court records, expressed gratitude for the opportunity to serve his people and confidence that the institutions he had created would continue to benefit Korea long after his death.
The man who had begun his reign as an unexpected king
died as one of history's most remarkable rulers.
The third son, who had never been meant to rule, had transformed a young military monarchy into a sophisticated civilization that would influence East Asian culture for centuries.
The scholar, king who had paid such a heavy personal price for his achievements, had created a legacy that justified every sacrifice he had made. His tomb, first established in Gwangju, and later moved to Yeoju,
became a site of pilgrimage for those who understood that
true greatness lies not in conquest or accumulation, but in the patient work of building institutions that serve human flourishing. The posthumous title bestowed upon him, Great King Sejong, the wise, literary, virtuous, martial, benevolent, sacred,
enlightened,
and filial, attempted to capture the multiple dimensions of his achievement, but could hardly encompass the full scope of his transformation of Korean civilization. In the end, perhaps the greatest tribute to King Sejong lies not in the monuments erected to his memory, but in the living culture that continues to benefit from his innovations. Every Korean who learns to read using Hangul, every farmer who benefits from systematic agricultural knowledge, every citizen who expects government to serve popular welfare rather than elite privilege, participates in the ongoing legacy of the scholar, king who understood that true power lies in empowering others. The winter winds that whispered through the palace courtyards of Hanyang on the night of his death carried with them the promise that his greatest works would outlive not only his own mortality, but the dynasty he had served so faithfully. The institutions he had created, the knowledge he had systematized, and the cultural confidence he had instilled in the Korean people would prove more durable than any individual life,
ensuring that his influence would continue to shape Korean civilization
long after the last person who remembered him personally had passed into history.
Close your eyes
and let these whispered memories carry you to peaceful sleep.